Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution Area of Study 1. In our last video, we looked at the Kuomintang government under Jiang Jie's leadership, based in Nanjing, in the period known as the Nanjing Decade, from 1927 to 1937. I mentioned that China's the story of the Chinese Revolution by the end of the Shanghai Massacre split into two stories, those of the nationalists and those of the communists. And in this video, we'll look at the CCP during this time. So first, a little bit of context. As we know, the Shanghai Massacre brought an end to the First United Front, that alliance between the GMD and the CCP, with the hopes of unifying China. Jiang Jieshi brought that to an end when he ordered the Shanghai Massacre and massacred thousands of communists in Shanghai and other cities. So the communists were not in a great state at this point. The Shanghai Massacre led to the breakdown of the United Front, and the communists and the nationalists were very much separate entities. On the 7th of August, 1927, Chen Duxiu resigned as CCP Secretary General, and was replaced by Chu Chubai. And in Russia, because as we know, Russia was still quite heavily influencing the CCP at this time through Comintern advisors, Trotsky accused Stalin of failing to devise effective policies for the Chinese communists. Trotsky and Stalin, as we'll remember from studying Russia, were butting heads at this point, and it wouldn't be long before Trotsky was exiled or fled Russia, and later Stalin had him killed. But at this point, Trotsky was accusing Stalin of not approaching the Chinese communists correctly, and Stalin, hoping to prove Trotsky wrong, dispatched two new Comintern advisors to China and directed several uprisings against the GMD. So that's where we start. Now let's have a look at some of these Stalin-directed uprisings. The first one, now these all take place towards the end of 1927. The first one is known as the Nanchang Uprising. It happened on the 1st of August, 1927, and several Nationalist Revolutionary Army divisions in Nanchang in Jiangxi province were led by communists. As you'll remember, the NRA, the Nationalist Revolutionary Army, was a largely GMD led army, but there were many communists as well. And so they launched an uprising in Nanchang, and these rebels seized control of the city and proclaimed a revolutionary government. The communists held out for 4 days before loyal nationalist troops, who were loyal to Jiang Jie's government, recaptured the city. Surviving communists fled south. The Autumn Harvest Uprising. Now, this one was led by Mao Zedong. Soldiers in Hunan hoped to incite an uprising among peasants to recapture the capital, Changsha. Now, I should note that, and as we'll find out in this video, Mao was slightly diverged from traditional Marxist attitudes that a revolution would inevitably come from the urban proletariat. He really saw the peasants as central to a revolution. And so he led this Autumn Harvest Uprising, and his forces seized a few towns, but really failed to get close to the capital, and they suffered severe casualties. Mao's 1,000 survivors fled and found sanctuary along the Hunan-Jiangxi border in the mountains. They were joined later by 2,000 soldiers led by Zhu Dei. Now, this will become relevant and significant shortly, and I'll explain why once we get to that part of the video. The last Stalin-directed uprising is, we can remember, as the Guangzhou Commune. And this happened on the 11th of December, 1927, when Stalin ordered Chu Chubei, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, apologies, So he and the CCP launched an uprising at Guangzhou. CCP troops seized control of the city and proclaimed a Guangzhou Soviet Council. A radical program of socialist measures was announced, including the redistribution of land, collective ownership of industry, and reduced working hours for the proletariat, all things that we saw in Russia. This commune and Soviet council lasted just 2 days before nationalists retook the city with the help of foreign aid. In the end, around 5,700 communists were killed. So Stalin's plans to deploy more Comintern agents to encourage further uprisings and further revolution didn't go so well. On top of that, the CCP was in complete disarray. Membership had fallen from 57,000 in early 1927 to only 10,000 by the end of the 1920s. The Sixth Party Congress of the CCP, I mean, this just shows how in a sheer state of disarray the CCP was, because the Sixth Party Congress, which was from the 18th of June to the 20th of July 1928, was held in Moscow, outside of China. And the Congress condemned the right opportunism of Chen Duxiu and the left deviationism of Qiu Chubai. Qiu was demoted and Li Lisan, who headed the party's propaganda department, got promoted. Li Lisan held strong views on the importance of the urban proletariat as the foundations of socialist revolution. And in 1930, he ordered the Communist Red Army, who had since the breakdown of the United Front, to launch another round of campaigns. They took Changsha, but were driven out after only 8 days. Now, Mao and Zhu Dai, who, as you'll remember, were basically hiding in the mountains at the Jiangxi border, they failed to capture Nanchang, and communist forces also made an unsuccessful attack on Wuhan. Jiangxi, as a response to these various uprisings and various attempted military campaigns, organized operations against communist rural bases that he had previously ignored. On the 8th of January 1931, Li was dismissed from the CCP leadership, and leadership was given to a group of Moscow-trained Chinese students who collectively became known as the 28 Bolsheviks. I've put that in pink here because even though I'm not going to go through all of their names, the 28 Bolsheviks can be considered like a unit of people who led the CCP at this time. Now, they were young and inexperienced, and the CCP Central Committee in Shanghai was far removed from the revolution taking shape in the mountain villages of Jiangxi, where Mao Zedong was based. So basically, there were multiple leadership changes at this time when the CCP was in a state of disarray, from Chen Duxiu to Qiu Chubai to Li Lisan to the 28 Bolsheviks, and then outside of all of that, there was Mao and Zhu Dai in Jiangxi, and that's where we go now. So the Jiangxi Soviet, first of all, here is Mao Zedong, and here is Zhu Dai. They organized a rural base in Jiangxi, and although Mao and Zhu mustered 10,000 troops, their men often went hungry and were under-equipped. Some were armed only with spears, which would be no match against Jiang Jie's fairly modern army. Mao recruited peasants and many outcasts of Chinese society, saying they are all human beings. He wanted his forces to become an improved Red Army. Mao is quoted as saying, "These people are capable of fighting very bravely, and if properly led, can become a revolutionary force." Now, in January 1929, Mao and Zhu had to abandon their Jiangxi mountain base after raids by Kuomintang armies, as well as difficulties finding enough food to feed their 10,000 troops. However, they found a new base deeper in the mountains in the small town of Ruijin. Now, on the 7th of November 1931, the first All China Congress of Soviets convened at Ruijin. Mao butted heads with the 28 Bolsheviks, fiercely debating CCP policy. Mao's faction was criticized for its opportunistic pragmatism, but it won out against the Comintern-backed Politburo and under the 28 Bolsheviks, and Mao's policies were eventually pursued. Now, let's be clear, Mao was not leading the party at this point. He was basically leading the Jiangxi Soviet, but at this first All China Congress of Soviets, they decided to pursue some of Mao's policies. So a Chinese Soviet Republic was proclaimed with Mao appointed chairman of its executive committee. Here is a quote from Mao. He said, "From now on, there are two totally different states in the territory of China. One is the so-called Republic of China. The other is the Chinese Soviet Republic, the state of the broad masses of the exploited and oppressed workers, peasants, soldiers, and toilers. Its banner is that of overthrowing imperialism, eliminating the landlord class, bringing down the Kuomintang warlord government, and striving for genuine peace and unification of the whole country." So he has pretty clear goals here: overthrow imperialism, eliminate the bourgeoisie or the landlord class, and bring down the Kuomintang government, who he describes as the Kuomintang warlord government. Now, it's important to note that a Chinese Soviet is different to a Russian Soviet. A Russian Soviet is a workers' council, sort of like a union in today's language. A Chinese Soviet was more of a community. So although Mao was chairman of the Jiangxi Soviet, the CCP Central Committee remained under the control of the 28 Bolsheviks. And historian Delia Davin argues that Ruijin was a social laboratory for trying out new ideas. So let's have a look at Mao's Red Army. Here's a fantastic quote from Mao. He said, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." So Zhu Dai was the commander-in-chief of the Red Army, while Mao was chief political commissar. His role was to give the army a sense of self-worth, discipline, and direction. The Red Army, it's important to note, was a volunteer force. And so political commissars, such as Mao being the chief political commissar, served alongside officers who were treated the same as soldiers. So officers in Mao's Red Army had no badges or honors to signify rank. They shared their men's hardships, including eating the same food, living in the same quarters, and they were not allowed to beat common soldiers. So they were it was very much a sort of egalitarian, equal army. Red Army soldiers were subject to strict rules of discipline, having to memorize and live by a code of conduct that was devised by Mao and Zhu. And we'll have a look at that in the next slide. When not on active duty, Red Army soldiers carried out chores such as cutting firewood for the surrounding communities and helping to sow crops. Now, in the past, army soldiers were known to be quite debaucherous when they were off duty, often raping and pillaging villages and not being very welcomed by the peasantry. However, the actions of the Red Army soldiers really won them respect among the peasantry and among the locals in the mountains of the Jiangxi province. Red Army personnel were often the first point of contact between the party and the people. So they were really important for garnering support, particularly from the peasants. So let's have a look at this code of conduct devised by Mao and Zhu. These are called the 3 rules of discipline and the 8 points for attention. So the 3 main rules of discipline are: 1, obey orders in all your actions; 2, don't take a single needle or piece of thread from the masses, i.e. leave the masses be, do not harm them; and 3, turn in everything that's captured. The 8 points for attention: 1, speak politely; 2, pay fairly for what you buy; 3, return everything you borrow; 4, pay for anything you damage; 5, don't hit or swear at people; 6, don't damage crops; 7, don't take liberties with women, and 8, don't ill-treat captives. So basically, don't be an asshole. If we're going to summarize, be kind to the people who you come across. And by following these codes of conduct, the Red Army really managed to garner support from the peasants and from the local community. And this would become important later. So the Red Army was known for some of the guerrilla tactics that they used. And the peasants, due to how much respect they had given the Red Army due to their conduct, had quite a significant role for the Red Army at this time. So Red Army troops were taught Zhu and Mao's general strategy. Mao had heard all about guerrilla tactics through reading and researching different army and military tactics. These general strategies were: the enemy advances, we retreat; the enemy camps, we harass; the enemy tires, we attack; the enemy retreats, we pursue. So from 1930 onwards, Jiangxi launched a number of unsuccessful bandit extermination campaigns against the communists at Jiangxi. The Red Army had support of the local peasants. This great quote from Mao says, "The peasants are the sea, we are the fish, the sea is our habitat," i.e. we need the peasants to survive. If you'll remember, all of these Stalin-directed uprisings angered Jiangxi, and he, as a result, started to launch counter-attacks. And that's why the Red Army was in this position. So Mao insisted that peasants could be a revolutionary class, dissenting from the correct path of Marxist proletarian revolution. Mao had many disputes with the CCP Politburo, and on the 12th of October 1932, Mao was replaced by Zhou Enlai as General Political Commissar of the Red Army. Basically, the CCP Politburo and the 28 Bolsheviks did not remotely agree with Mao's belief that the peasants could be a revolutionary class. They firmly believed in a Marxist, traditional Marxist idea of what a proletariat, a socialist revolution would look like, with the proletariat leading the way. As Mao is quoted as saying, "From 1931 to 1934, I had no voice at all at the center." So Mao was really sort of starting to be pushed out at this point. In January 1933, things got even worse for Mao because the Central Committee moved from Shanghai to Ruijin, where Mao was, and the leadership of the CCP undermined Mao at every opportunity. Now, because Mao had no input in broad policy and military matters, sort of the higher up issues at play, he focused on civil administration, such as economic and social policies. And there were many social changes that took place at the Jiangxi Soviet. So some of this social change, there were initiatives at the Jiangxi Soviet to improve education, to improve gender equity and services for locals. We can directly contrast this with the New Life movement under Jiang Jie's government, where, for instance, they were returning to traditional values, and women were seen again as their most important role was as heads of household. On the flip side, at the Jiangxi Soviet, reading classes were held for soldiers and peasants, which women were encouraged to attend. Mao said that educating a man means educating an individual, while teaching a woman means educating a whole family. So he saw the education of women as really crucial at the Jiangxi Soviet. The CCP also campaigned against foot binding, which had been in place for many, many years. They campaigned against forced marriages and child slavery. Divorce and marriage rights were made equally available to women as they were for men. Opium farming was strongly discouraged. A red postal service was established, and a people's bank was established with its own currency. Now, while the Jiangxi Soviet only lasted 3 years, it came to govern 3 million people in a region covering 30,000 square kilometers. And an extra 3 million people were under similar rules in neighboring provinces. Now, that sort of brings us to the end of the CCP, the end of this video about the Jiangxi Soviet mainly. Now, this hasn't taken us all the way through the Nanjing Decade from 1927 to 1937. It's only taken us up to 1934. That's because Jiang Jishi's campaigns against the communists eventually broke through and eventually were successful. And that launched in 1934, the Long March, which will be the focus of our next video. So just hold that thought. We're still in the Nanjing Decade for the communists, and our next video will be on the Long March. However, this last slide is about some of the less desirable aspects of Mao as a leader. So during the Jiangxi period, Mao showed that he could be ruthless towards those who got in his way. And here's just a short story about his ruthlessness. In October 1930, Mao instigated a purge of Red Army units who he saw to have questionable loyalty. He accused one unit, known as the 20th Corps, of being loyal to Li Lisan and accused them of protecting members of a secret GMD clique, the Anti-Bolshevik League. Mao placed 4,000 men from the 20th Corps under arrest and had 1,000 of them executed. Many were tortured to extract a confession with some fairly brutal torture techniques that you can read about in your textbook. On the 8th of December, 1930, some of the remaining soldiers from this unit managed to free their comrades and retreated to a neighboring town where they hoped they would be safe. They were very anti-Mao, as you can imagine, chanting and holding and displaying banners such as "Death to Mao Zedong." And for months, the 20th Corps remained an independent group, separate from the Jiangxi Soviet under Mao's leadership. In June 1931, Mao called a meeting of the rebel officers, and surprisingly, they all came to the meeting, 200 in total. Now, they hoped to resolve their differences, put aside this tension, but Mao's loyal troops seized the officers and executed them on the spot. Now, this purge of Red Army units with questionable loyalty, people who were considered or accused of being opposed to the communists, spread throughout the Jiangxi Soviet, who at this point there were 3 million people in the Jiangxi Soviet. And historian Sun Shuyun argues that the purge claimed up to 20,000 people over the course of a single year. So Mao, at this point, I mean, earlier in this video, it seems like Mao is a fantastic leader who really sees the value in the peasants and has some really strong revolutionary values. However, he was not a perfect individual by any means. He was quite violent and showed that he could be quite ruthless when faced with opposition, and that will definitely come into the forefront later. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Our next video will be on the Long March, so I will see you next time.